So on April 28, 2026, Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne stood in the House of Commons and tabled the Canadian government's Spring Economic Update. It is a formal fiscal document, a government's official accounting of where the economy stands, where the risks lie, and how the government intends to manage its finances for the next 5 years. It is the kind of document that central bank governors, bond traders, foreign investors, credit rating agencies, pension fund managers, and every serious institution that has any financial stake in the Canadian economy reads with careful attention because every word in it is chosen with precision, and every risk it names is named because the government has determined that naming it is the accurate and necessary thing to do. The Spring Economic Update 2026 named 2 primary threats to the Canadian economic outlook. The first was the conflict in the Middle East, the Iran war that had closed the Strait of Hormuz and disrupted global energy supply chains. The second was not China, not Russia, not the collapse of the multilateral trading system in the abstract. The second threat, placed by the Government of Canada in the same category as a Middle East war for the purposes of fiscal scenario planning, was named in 4 specific words. Escalating trade pressure, including U.S. tariffs. 4 words in a government fiscal document. Rising geopolitical tensions, the document says, including the conflict in the Middle East and escalating trade pressure such as U.S. tariffs, are adding to cost pressures and driving volatility in energy prices and financial markets. U.S. tariffs. Not foreign tariffs in general. Not trade policy uncertainty as an abstraction. American tariffs. Named. In a Canadian government fiscal document, alongside a Middle East war, as a source of geopolitical risk to the Canadian economy. And then the Eurasia Group, the world's preeminent geopolitical risk firm, whose annual top risks report is read by every treasury, every central bank, every major investment institution on Earth, published its 2026 assessment and placed the United States itself as risk number 1. Not Russia, not China, not climate, the United States of America. Risk number 1? Its language was the language of institutional analysis rather than political commentary, which makes it more rather than less devastating. It said Trump is attempting to dismantle checks on his power, capture the machinery of government, and weaponize it against his enemies, making the United States the principal source of global risk in 2026. The principal source? Not a contributor to risk, not a complicating factor. The principal source of global risk. In 2026, while Trump was demanding total loyalty from Canada, calling its Prime Minister governor, threatening annexation, decertifying its aircraft on social media at night, applying 50% tariffs to its steel, terminating trade talks over a television advertisement, and issuing a July 4th ultimatum to the European Union, after his own trade representative had agreed with Brussels 4 days earlier to respect the terms of the Turnberry deal, the Government of Canada embedded his trade policy in its fiscal risk framework alongside a Middle East war. And the world's leading geopolitical risk firm called his administration the principal source of global risk. Warren Buffett said the most consequential institutional designation in any business relationship is not a rejection or a confrontation. It is a reclassification. When an institution moves a partner from the trusted column to the risk column in its official planning documents, it does not announce a rupture. It builds every future decision around the new classification, quietly, permanently. Hit subscribe because Canada's goods exports to the United States fell 11.1% below pre-tariff levels by the end of 2025. Private sector economists embedded in Canada's official forecast do not anticipate a return to broadly open low-tariff global trade, and the World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report 2026 placed geoeconomic confrontation, the precise category into which American tariff policy falls, as the number 1 global risk over both the immediate and 2-year time horizons, rising 8 positions from the previous year's ranking. Let me take you through what total loyalty actually looks like in the context of the Canada-United States relationship over the past 15 months, because the pattern of what has been demanded is the context that makes the April 28th reclassification not just a bureaucratic act but a strategic declaration. Loyalty, as Trump has demanded it from Canada, is not the loyalty of a genuine alliance. It is the loyalty of a client state. It is the loyalty of a country that accepts without objection the annexation language directed at its sovereign territory. The loyalty of a government whose leader accepts being called governor by the president of a neighboring country without diplomatic consequence. The loyalty of a prime minister who certifies American aircraft because the American president decertified Canadian aircraft on social media at night without telling the FAA first. The loyalty of a country that removes its digital services tax and lifts most of its retaliatory tariffs as concessions made in good faith, and then receives a trade talk termination over a provincial television advertisement in return. The loyalty of an ally that accepts 50% tariffs on its steel, 25% tariffs on its automobiles, a 10% global surcharge on everything else that two courts have now called unauthorized by law, and that does not cancel its NORAD obligations, does not withdraw from the Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangement, does not refuse to train alongside American forces in the Arctic exercise that brought 32,000 troops to Norway in March, and does not say publicly that the alliance relationship is severed. Carney has not said any of those things. He has maintained every institutional commitment that the bilateral relationship depends on, at the security and intelligence and defense levels where the commitment is genuinely mutual. What he has refused to do is what Trump's definition of loyalty requires. He has refused to accept the tariffs as legitimate. He has refused to call the USMCA irrelevant. He has refused to certify the Gulfstream jets under tariff duress. He has refused to accept an entry fee for USMCA negotiations. He has refused to treat the 51st state rhetoric as something other than what it is. And he has refused to frame Canada's economic future as contingent on American permission. The refusals are documented, public, sequential, and cumulative. And Trump's response to each refusal has been the response of a principal who cannot tolerate a client that maintains its own judgment alongside its institutional loyalty. He called Carney governor. He posted memes of the American flag stretching across Canada and Greenland. He decertified Canadian aircraft. He terminated trade talks. He had his deputy trade representative call Carney not a grown-up at the Council on Foreign Relations. He had his Commerce Secretary say Canada sucks at a public conference, and then had the Commerce Department clarify that what was meant was that Canada sucks off of America's $30 trillion economy. Total loyalty demanded. Total loyalty refused. And then, on April 28th, the refusal was formalized in a fiscal document. The Spring Economic Update's official scenario planning is the technical expression of the reclassification that the title describes. Government fiscal documents in Canada, unlike political speeches or diplomatic statements, are subject to specific professional and legal standards. The numbers in them must be defensible to the parliamentary budget officer. The risk scenarios must be plausible and documented. The language describing economic threats must reflect the actual state of the evidence available to the Department of Finance. When the Spring Economic Update 2026 names U.S. tariffs alongside the Middle East conflict as the two primary sources of elevated risk to the Canadian fiscal outlook, it is not making a political statement. It is making an actuarial one. The government's economists and finance officials assessed the landscape, identified the material risks, and wrote them down in the document that will govern Canada's fiscal planning for the next 5 years. And the risk they wrote down under the heading of geopolitical tensions is not abstract trade policy uncertainty. It is U.S. tariffs, specifically, by name, in the same sentence as a Middle East war. The document describes two planning scenarios built around alternative paths for global conditions. In one scenario, higher oil prices driven by prolonged Middle East disruption push WTI toward $115 per barrel by the second quarter of 2026. In this scenario, Canada, as a net exporter of oil, benefits from improved terms of trade and is seen as a reliable source of energy products as geopolitical risks and uncertainty in the Middle East persist, supporting demand for Canadian crude oil. In the other scenario, global supply disruptions from the Strait of Hormuz blockade and damage to critical energy infrastructure drive up shipping costs and weigh on global growth. In both scenarios, the one in which Canada benefits and the one in which it absorbs additional shock, the assumptions about U.S. tariff policy are consistent. Private sector economists in the early March survey expected current tariffs on Canada to remain in place over the near term. The document does not forecast tariff relief. It does not build a scenario around a successful CUSMA renewal that removes the steel and aluminum tariffs. It builds its fiscal framework around the assumption, shared by every private sector economist whose projections are embedded in the government's planning, that the tariffs are a structural feature of the bilateral relationship rather than a temporary negotiating instrument. That assumption is itself the reclassification. When Canada's official fiscal planning stops modeling tariff relief as a plausible scenario and starts modeling tariffs as a permanent cost, the United States has been reclassified from partner to risk. The document does it without drama and without confrontation. It does it with arithmetic. The statistics that sit behind the Spring Economic Update's risk language tell the human story underneath the fiscal document. Canada's nominal goods exports to the United States by the end of 2025 were 11.1% lower than levels reported in March 2025, the month before the tariff escalations reached their current intensity. They were 16.7% lower than levels observed in December 2024. Canada's merchandise imports from the United States were 9.8% below pre-tariff levels by December 2025. The bilateral trade that had been building for decades, that the USMCA was designed to protect and deepen, contracted in both directions. Not by catastrophic amounts that would be visible as a crisis in a single quarterly GDP report, by the kind of sustained, compounding, directionally consistent decline that tells an institutional story about a relationship whose equilibrium has shifted permanently rather than cyclically. At the same time, Canada's merchandise exports to countries other than the United States ramped up in the second half of 2025. Shipments to non-American countries rose as trade disruptions escalated toward mid-year and then strengthened during the fall months as businesses continued to navigate trade tensions. The bilateral contraction and the multilateral expansion are happening simultaneously. That is not a coincidence or a market fluctuation. It is a structural reorientation that the Spring Economic Update's fiscal framework is built around. Total employment increased by over 200,000 jobs in 2025, despite manufacturing sector losses, because the domestic economy and the alternative trade channels absorbed some of what the American tariffs displaced. The unemployment rate rose to 7.1% in August and September of 2025, the highest since May 2016, excluding the pandemic period, and then began to ease. Real GDP grew 1.7% in 2025, second fastest in the G7. The economy did not collapse. It adjusted. And the fiscal document embeds the adjustment as the new baseline, not the pre-tariff equilibrium as the recovery target. Warren Buffett has watched institutions make the transition from treating a partner as an ally to treating a partner as a risk in business negotiations across 7 decades, and he has identified the specific moment at which the transition becomes irreversible. He says the transition becomes irreversible not when the first hostile action is taken, but when the institution formally updates its planning documents to reflect the new assessment. Because planning documents govern resource allocation. They determine what gets funded and what gets defunded, what gets built and what gets allowed to atrophy. A company that reclassifies a supplier from strategic partner to risk will stop investing in the integration that made the partnership valuable. It will stop sending its best people to maintain the relationship. It will stop treating the supplier's concerns as priorities in its own operational decisions. It will start building alternatives, not because anyone announced that the relationship was over, because the planning document said risk, and every budget cycle after that built on that assessment. He said Canada's spring economic update embedding U.S. tariffs as a geopolitical risk in the same category as a Middle East war is the planning document event. Every subsequent Canadian budget, every resource allocation decision, every infrastructure investment, every trade partnership, every defense procurement choice will be made in the context of a fiscal framework that names the United States as a source of geopolitical risk alongside a regional conflict. That is not a political speech. It is a governing document, and governing documents govern. The Eurasia Group's Top Risks 2026 report published in January of this year is the institutional context that makes the Canadian government's Spring Economic Update language legible in its full significance. Eurasia Group is not a Canadian institution. It is the world's leading geopolitical risk consultancy, founded and run by Ian Bremer, whose annual Top Risks report has been the primary reference document for institutional investors, corporate board risk committees, sovereign wealth funds, and government planning offices worldwide for decades. Its methodology is not partisan. It assesses risk based on the probability and magnitude of politically driven outcomes that affect economic systems and markets. Risk number 1. In 2026, the risk it assessed as the most significant and most probable source of disruption to the global order is not a conflict between China and the United States. It is not Russian aggression in Europe. It is not climate change or pandemic risk or technological disruption. It is what the report titles the U.S. political revolution. The language of the risk description is not inflammatory. It is clinical. It says that Trump is attempting to dismantle checks on his power, capture the machinery of government, and weaponize it against his enemies, making the United States the principal source of global risk in 2026. And the Eurasia Group wrote a specific addendum for Canada, describing the implications of the top risks for the Canadian economy and geopolitical position. In that addendum, it described the U.S. under Trump as an unpredictable and unreliable partner whose trade uncertainty will weigh on the Canadian economy and whose unilateral power in the Western Hemisphere Canada must manage defensively while simultaneously building alternative trade and strategic relationships. Unpredictable. Unreliable. Those are the words the world's leading geopolitical risk firm uses to characterize the United States in 2026, in a document read by every major investment institution in the world. Embedded in the risk frameworks of pension funds in Europe and Asia and the Middle East that manage trillions of dollars of capital, and whose allocation decisions about Canada versus the United States are shaped by the risk assessments their own investment committees commission. The reclassification is not limited to Ottawa. It is running simultaneously in every major institutional capital allocation framework in the world. And then there is the World Economic Forum, the Davos Institution, the global convening organization that brings together 700 heads of state and government, thousands of business leaders, and the institutional frameworks of every major multilateral organization. Its Global Risks Report 2026, the 21st annual edition of the most widely read global risk assessment document in the world, was published in January 2026. It placed geoeconomic confrontation at the top of its Global Risks Perception Survey, ranking over both the immediate term and the 2-year time horizon, rising 8 positions compared to the previous year's ranking. 8 positions? The risk that the expert community of over 1,300 respondents worldwide assessed as rising fastest in severity and probability is geoeconomic confrontation. The risk that is, in the language of the WEF report itself, closely interlinked with state-based armed conflict and driven by the specific set of risks around trade and tariffs that the United States has been generating. The WEF does not name the United States as the source of geoeconomic confrontation in its headline risk language. It doesn't need to. Every expert in the room knows which country increased its tariffs to levels not seen since the Great Depression, which country invoked an emergency powers law to do it, which country had that law struck down by its own Supreme Court 6-3, and which country then invoked a different law that a second court has now also called unauthorized. The WEF survey captures what the institutional expert community is thinking and what it is thinking, reflected in geoeconomic confrontation, rising 8 positions to the top of the global risk ranking, is that American trade policy is the primary driver of the deterioration in global economic governance in 2026. The WEF report also names the IMF's assessment that global GDP growth in 2026 could be reduced to 2.5% under higher oil prices that persist into 2027, or even to 2% approaching a global recession under a severe scenario where price pressures spill over beyond energy markets. The Eurasia Group calls it risk number 1. The WEF ranks it the top global risk. The Canadian government embeds it in its fiscal planning documents alongside a Middle East war. The world has reclassified the United States as a source of risk, and the specific expression of that reclassification in Ottawa came in a fiscal document tabled in the House of Commons on April 28, 2026. The specific loyalties that Trump has demanded from Canada since February of 2025, laid out in sequence, constitute a portrait of what total loyalty looks like as a foreign policy demand applied to a sovereign democratic neighbor. He demanded that Canada accept tariffs he described as legitimate retaliation for fentanyl trafficking across the border, based on a designation the Drug Enforcement Administration's own data does not substantively support for the Canadian border as a primary fentanyl source. He demanded that Canada certify American aircraft whose manufacturers had unresolved disputes with Transport Canada, as though the certification process of a sovereign nation's aviation regulator was subject to American political instruction. He demanded that Canada make a series of concessions on dairy, digital services, streaming regulation, and online news just to get to the USMCA review table, not as part of a deal, but as preconditions for a conversation about a deal. He demanded that Canada treat the 51st state rhetoric as something to be managed diplomatically rather than rejected categorically. He demanded that Canada's Premier of Ontario take down a television advertisement featuring a dead American president's words about the economic harm of tariffs. He demanded that Canada stop building alternative trade partnerships with Europe, Asia, and the Nordic nations that might reduce Canada's strategic dependence on the American market, with his trade representative telling visiting Canadian envoys in Washington just 11 days ago that Canada should not attempt to use its energy and natural resources as leverage. He demanded, through his social media accounts, his administration officials, and his formal diplomatic channels, an ongoing deference that treated every bilateral dispute as one in which the American position was automatically legitimate and the Canadian position was automatically an act of defiance that required correction. Carney refused every specific demand that touched Canadian sovereignty. He maintained every institutional commitment that did not require that Canada treat American tariff policy as legitimate. And he did so while the Eurasia Group published its top risks report calling the administration demanding the deference the principal source of global risk. And while the WEF published its risk rankings placing geoeconomic confrontation at the top. And while on April 28th, Finance Minister Champagne stood in the House of Commons and named U.S. tariffs as a source of geopolitical risk in the official Canadian government fiscal planning document. The reclassification is documented, it is public, it is embedded in a governing document, and it will govern. The Canada Strong Fund, announced in the Spring Economic Update as a $25 billion sovereign wealth fund, is the institutional expression of what building around the risk classification looks like. A sovereign wealth fund is what governments build when they have determined that their long-term economic interests require a capital allocation mechanism that operates on timelines and with mandates that are longer and broader than any single bilateral relationship. Norway's sovereign wealth fund, the world's largest at $3.5 trillion, was built on oil revenues and designed to ensure that the Norwegian economy has capital available to invest in its future, regardless of what oil prices or any single trading relationship produces in any given decade. Canada's Canada Strong Fund, announced at $25 billion with plans for retail investor participation that would make it the broadest ownership base of any Canadian strategic investment vehicle, is being built on the same principle. It will invest in the projects and companies driving Canada's economic transformation. It was announced in the same fiscal document that named U.S. tariffs as a geopolitical risk. The document that builds a sovereign wealth fund to invest Canada's future is the same document that names the most important bilateral relationship in that future as a source of geopolitical risk. The two things in the same document are not a contradiction. They are the same policy. The sovereign wealth fund is what building around the reclassified risk looks like in institutional form. You do not build a $25 billion sovereign wealth fund to manage a temporary tariff dispute that will be resolved at the CUSMA review table. You build it to ensure that Canada's long-term economic trajectory does not depend on the goodwill of the partner you have just named as a source of geopolitical risk. The $97 billion in foreign investment secured in the 12 months covered by the Spring Economic Update is the market's response to the same reclassification. When Canada officially names U.S. tariffs as a geopolitical risk and simultaneously deploys 16 free trade agreements covering 51 countries and two-thirds of global GDP, builds a $25 billion sovereign wealth fund, commits to a September 2026 investment summit, signs security and defense partnerships with the European Union, joins the EU's SAFE initiative as its first non-European member, holds a Canada-Nordic summit that produces a joint Arctic security commitment, completes the Trans Mountain Pipeline 3 years ahead of schedule, with Asian buyers filling it to the high 90s in utilization, and announces a new 1 million barrel per day West Coast pipeline heading to Asian markets by July of this year. What the rest of the world sees is a country that has done its strategic planning around a specific risk assessment and is executing that plan with the precision of a former central banker who understands that the most important thing in any crisis is to maintain both the optionality and the institutional capacity to take advantage of the moment when the crisis produces an opportunity. The $97 billion is not random. It is the market's actuarial response to Canada's own risk assessment. If Canada has named American trade policy as a geopolitical risk and is demonstrably building around that risk, capital that had previously assumed the Canada-United States economic integration was stable and deepening needs to revalue both Canada and the United States. Canada as a stable alternative to a geopolitically volatile bilateral dependency is worth more capital than Canada as a deeply integrated American economic appendage. And the United States as a source of geopolitical risk rather than a source of institutional stability is worth less capital as a primary destination than it was when its trade policy was governed by the WTO rules it helped write and the NAFTA framework it helped negotiate. The Spring Update is the official documentation. The $97 billion is the market acting on the information before the document was formally published. Warren Buffett said the institutional reclassification event, the moment a major economy formally names another major economy as a source of geopolitical risk in its official planning documents, is the event that every board risk committee and every sovereign wealth fund and every pension fund investment committee must respond to. Not because the reclassification creates a new political reality, he said, but because it documents an existing one. The political reality of the Canada-United States relationship had been deteriorating for 15 months before the Spring Economic Update was tabled. The tariffs had been running for 15 months. The annexation rhetoric had been running for 15 months. The court rulings had been running for 15 months. The trade talk terminations had been running. The aircraft decertifications had been running. The July 4th ultimatum to Europe had been running. The Greer warning to Canada about energy leverage had been running. The Lutnick Canada sucks statement had been running. The Switzer not a grown-up comment had been running. None of it was new on April 28th. What was new was that it was in the fiscal planning document, and the fiscal planning document is the moment that institutional response becomes mandatory rather than discretionary. Because a risk that is named in a government fiscal document must be factored into every capital allocation, every investment decision, every procurement choice, every strategic partnership that the government of Canada makes from that point forward. He paused. Trump demanded total loyalty. What he received was official documentation, which is the thing that outlasts any presidency and governs every institutional decision that follows. So here's where we stand today, May the 10th of 2026. On April 28th, 2026, the Canadian government tabled its Spring Economic Update, naming U.S. tariffs as a source of geopolitical risk in its official fiscal planning documents alongside a Middle East war, embedding private sector economists' assumption that tariffs would remain in place as the baseline rather than tariff relief as the recovery scenario, and announcing a $25 billion sovereign wealth fund to build Canada's long-term economic resilience independent of any single bilateral relationship. The Eurasia Group's Top Risks 2026 report named the United States as the principal source of global risk in 2026, describing the Trump administration as capturing the machinery of government and weaponizing it against its enemies. The World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report 2026 placed geoeconomic confrontation, the risk category directly driven by American tariff policy, at the top of its global risk rankings, rising 8 positions from the previous year. Canada's real GDP fell on a per capita basis as U.S. tariffs contributed to declines in goods exports, a pullback in business investment, and job losses in tariff-exposed sectors, while the broader economy grew 1.7% in 2025, second fastest in the G7. Canadian goods exports to the United States fell 11.1% below pre-tariff levels by December 2025. Non-American Canadian exports ramped up simultaneously. Canada secured $97 billion in foreign investment and more than 20 economic and defense partnerships across 4 continents in the same 12-month period. And formal CUSMA review talks have not yet begun, with 52 days until the statutory deadline. Can an administration that 3 separate risk institutions have classified as the world's principal source of geopolitical risk restore the trust-based, rules-governed trade relationship with Canada that would remove the U.S. tariff language from Canada's fiscal planning documents? Can a July 4th ultimatum to Europe and a demand that Canada's energy minister stop treating natural resources as leverage rebuild the relationship that Eurasia Group describes as the long-standing partnership based on ever-increasing economic integration and rock-solid security partnership that is now history? And the question that the Spring Economic Update answered in official government language on April 28th in the most understated, technically precise, legally binding way that a parliamentary fiscal document can answer a question: when a country names its closest ally as a source of geopolitical risk in the same category as a Middle East war, how far from total loyalty has the demand taken the relationship? Trump demanded total loyalty. Carney tabled the fiscal update. The word loyalty does not appear in it. The words U.S. tariffs do, alongside the Middle East conflict, in the risk category, filed with the parliamentary budget officer for the next 5 years.